It was late October when I decided to spend a week in a cabin I'd rented deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I was 34 at the time and had been working nonstop for months. The idea of solitude, fresh air, and the quiet of the forest was exactly what I needed. The cabin was about 20 miles from the nearest town, a small speck on the map that barely had a gas station and a diner. It was one of those places where you felt the weight of isolation the moment you arrived. The cabin itself was simple but charming. It had a weathered wooden exterior, a tin roof, and a small front porch with a single rocking chair. Inside, there was a modest kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and one bedroom with a bed that creaked whenever I shifted. It wasn't luxurious, but it was enough for me. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent my time reading, hiking the trails that wound through the dense forest, and cooking simple meals on the old stove. The silence out there was almost overwhelming at first, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. At night, the darkness was absolute. Without any nearby towns or streetlights, the only light came from the moon and stars when the sky was clear. I kept a lantern nearby just in case, but I tried to embrace the darkness, letting it lull me to sleep. On the third night, something strange happened. I was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, enjoying the cool evening air and the sound of crickets. I just finished a cup of coffee and was about to head inside when I noticed something odd. Far down the dirt road that led to the cabin, I thought I saw a light. It was faint, barely noticeable through the trees, but it was there. At first, I thought it might be a car, but it didn't move like headlights. It flickered, almost like a lantern or a flashlight. I stood there for a while, staring down the road, trying to make sense of it. The light didn't get closer or move away. It just hovered in place. After a few minutes, it disappeared. I shrugged it off, thinking it might have been a reflection or some trick of the light, and went inside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it was off. The next morning, I decided to explore the area near where I'd seen the light. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just trying to satisfy my curiosity. The road was as empty and quiet as ever, and I didn't see any signs of recent activity. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. I told myself it was probably nothing and went about my day. That evening, things got stranger. I was chopping firewood behind the cabin when I felt it. A prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I paused, axe in hand, and scanned the tree line. The woods were still, the only movement coming from the wind swaying the branches. I told myself it was just paranoia and kept working, but the feeling didn't go away. After dinner, I locked the doors and windows, something I hadn't bothered to do the previous nights. I didn't feel scared exactly, but I was uneasy. The thought of someone else being out there, in the middle of nowhere, didn't sit right with me. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise. It was faint, but in the stillness of the cabin, it sounded loud. It was a soft tapping, coming from the direction of the porch. My heart started to race as I lay there, listening. Top, top, top. It wasn't rhythmic or steady, more like someone tapping their fingernails on wood. I got out of bed as quietly as I could, grabbed the flashlight I kept on the nightstand, and crept toward the front door. The tapping stopped before I reached it. I peered through the small window on the door but saw nothing. The porch was empty as far as I could tell. I opened the door just enough to shine the flashlight outside, but the beam revealed nothing unusual. I closed the door, locked it again, and went back to bed, though I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found footprints on the porch. They were faint, but they were there, muddy impressions of bare feet. They led up to the door and then back down the steps, disappearing into the dirt road. My stomach turned. Someone had been there, standing on the porch while I slept. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Whoever it was had been bold enough to walk up to the cabin. But why? And why barefoot? I decided to leave that day. The cabin was paid for through the week, but I didn't care. The peace and solitude I'd been seeking had been replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. I packed up my things quickly, double-checked that I hadn't left anything behind, and loaded my car. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. But there was no one. The woods were as empty as ever. About a mile from the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the side of the road, partially hidden by the trees, was a man. He was standing perfectly still, facing the road, as if waiting for something. He was tall and thin, with long, unkempt hair and a beard. His clothes were dirty and tattered, and he wasn't wearing any shoes. As I passed him, he didn't move. He didn't wave, didn't call out. He just stood there, staring at my car with an expression I couldn't read. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they hurt, and my heart was pounding in my chest. When I finally reached the highway, I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. I couldn't shake the image of that man, standing there in the woods, watching me. For weeks after I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was he? Why was he there? And what would have happened if I'd stayed at the cabin one more night? To this day, I don't have answers, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that cabin, or any cabin in the middle of nowhere, ever again. I've been in the Army for over 10 years, and I've seen more than my fair share of strange situations. I'm not one to get rattled easily. I've been deployed overseas, faced situations where my life was on the line, and worked undercover in places where trust was a scarce commodity. But there's one assignment that still sticks with me, something I can't explain away as just bad luck or a string of coincidences. It happened in 2017 in a remote part of Montana. I was 32 years old at the time, a special agent in the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. My job was to investigate crimes involving military personnel, anything from fraud to violent crimes. This particular case was supposed to be simple. A senior officer stationed at a small training facility had gone AWOL, and I was tasked with finding out why. The officer's name was Captain Michael Harris. He was in his late 40s with an impeccable record. He'd been stationed at a temporary facility in the mountains, used for survival training and simulations. Harris had been on a routine assignment, overseeing a small team of soldiers. Then, without warning, he disappeared. His team reported him missing after he failed to show up for a scheduled briefing. His car was still parked on the base, and there was no indication that he'd left voluntarily. When I arrived, the base commander briefed me. The facility was small, just a collection of cabins and outbuildings nestled deep in the forest. It was isolated, the nearest town over an hour away. The soldiers who had been under Harris's command were still there, waiting for reassignment. They were tense, on edge. Something about the situation had rattled them, but they wouldn't say what. I decided to start my investigation at the cabin Harris had been staying in. It was a small, one-room structure at the edge of the base, surrounded by dense forest. I'd seen plenty of military cabins before, but something about this one felt off the moment I stepped inside. The cabin was sparsely furnished, just a bed, a desk, and a few chairs. Harris's personal items were still there. Clothes neatly folded in a duffel bag, a notebook on the desk, and a half-empty mug of coffee sitting cold by the sink. It was as if he'd stepped out for a moment and never returned. I started by going through his notebook. It was a mix of work notes and personal thoughts. At first, it was all routine schedules, observations about the soldiers, reminders to call his wife. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed. He'd started writing about hearing strange noises at night, footsteps outside the cabin, whispers that seemed to come from the forest. One entry caught my attention. Last night, I heard it again, a low humming sound, almost like a generator, but there's nothing out here that could make that noise. I went outside to check, but it stopped as soon as I opened the door. This place is messing with my head. I decided to spend the night in the cabin, hoping to experience whatever Harris had been talking about. The first few hours were uneventful. I went over his notes again, trying to piece together his state of mind. Around midnight, I heard it, a low humming sound, just as Harris had described. I froze, listening carefully. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I stepped outside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The forest was silent except for that strange hum. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow it. I wasn't armed. This was supposed to be a simple investigation, not a combat mission, but I carried a tactical knife and a flashlight. The hum grew louder as I moved deeper into the forest, but it was impossible to pinpoint its source. It seemed to echo all around me, bouncing off the trees. After about 20 minutes of walking, I came across a clearing. In the center was a metal hatch, partially covered by leaves and dirt. It looked old, the kind of thing you'd find in a Cold War-era bunker. There were no markings, no indication of what it was or who it belonged to. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the ground. I hesitated, considering my options. I could report this back to the base commander and wait for reinforcements, or I could investigate further on my own. Against my better judgment, I decided to open the hatch. Took some effort, but I managed to pry it open. A ladder descended into darkness, and the hum was almost deafening now. I climbed down slowly, my flashlight illuminating a narrow tunnel. The walls were lined with metal, and the air was stale and damp. The tunnel led to a small room, empty except for a single table and chair. On the table was a radio, the kind used for long-range communication. It was powered on, but there was no one on the other end. The hum was coming from the radio, a steady, low-frequency sound that seemed to resonate in my chest. I turned the radio off and the hum stopped. The sudden silence was almost more unsettling than the noise. That's when I noticed something else. Scratches on the walls, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by human nails. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been down here, and they'd been desperate to get out. I decided I'd seen enough. I climbed back up the ladder and replaced the hatch, covering it as best I could. As I made my way back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked the door and double-checked the windows. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the chair with my knife in hand, listening for any sound outside. The next morning, I reported the hatch to the base commander. A team was sent to investigate, but when they opened it, the tunnel was gone. The hatch led to nothing but dirt, as if the room I'd seen had never existed. I don't know what happened to Captain Harris, and I don't think I ever will. The official report listed him as AWOL, but I know better. Something out there took him, and it was watching me, too. Even now, years later, I can't forget the sound of that hum. It's like it's burned into my brain, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. I had just turned 22 when my friend Mark invited me to stay with him for a couple of weeks at his grandmother's old farm cabin in the French countryside. It was late summer, 2012, and the idea of a quiet getaway sounded perfect. Life had been hectic, and I thought a break in a rural part of France would be just what I needed. Mark had always spoken fondly of his grandmother's place, describing it as isolated, peaceful, and surrounded by sprawling fields that stretched into dense forests. The cabin itself was old. More than 100 years, Mark had said. It had been passed down through his family for generations, though no one lived there anymore. His grandmother had moved into a smaller house in a nearby village after his grandfather passed away. Despite its age, the cabin was apparently still in good condition, and Mark promised I'd love the quiet escape. We drove there in his beaten-up old Peugeot, leaving the city behind and trading its noise for the hum of crickets and the occasional call of a bird. The further we drove, the more remote the area became. The roads narrowed, the trees closed in, and eventually, we turned onto a gravel path that wound its way through a dense patch of woods. The cabin appeared at the end of the road, sitting in a clearing surrounded by golden fields. It was a modest structure, 2 floors, with weathered wooden siding and a red-tiled roof that had seen better days. The shutters hung slightly askew, and ivy crept up one side of the house. There was a barn a short distance away, its doors closed tight, and an old stone well beside it. We unloaded our bags and went inside. The cabin smelled faintly of wood and dust, as if it hadn't been aired out in a while. The interior was simple but cozy, wood-paneled walls, an old stone fireplace, and sturdy furniture that looked like it had been there for decades. There was no TV, no internet, and no cell service. Mark had warned me about that, but I didn't mind. The first few days passed uneventfully. We spent our time exploring the fields and woods, fishing in a nearby stream, and sitting by the fireplace at night with a bottle of wine. It was everything I had hoped for, calm and quiet. On the 5th day, Mark decided to drive into the village to pick up more supplies. He asked if I wanted to come, but I declined. I liked the solitude, and the idea of having the cabin to myself for a while was appealing. He left mid-morning, and I spent the first part of the day reading and wandering around the property. In the early afternoon, I decided to check out the barn. Mark hadn't mentioned it much, and I was curious about what was inside. The doors were heavy and creaked loudly as I pushed them open. Dust motes danced in the sunlight that filtered through the gaps in the wooden walls. The barn was mostly empty, save for a few rusted tools, an old plow, and some broken furniture piled in one corner. There were hay bales stacked against one wall, though they looked old and dry. As I moved further inside, I noticed something odd. A section of the floorboards near the back looked newer than the rest, as if they had been replaced recently. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crouched down to inspect the area. The boards were nailed down tightly, but there was a small gap between 2 of them, just wide enough to peer through. I couldn't see much, just darkness. It looked like there was a space beneath the barn floor, but I couldn't tell how big it was. I stood up, feeling a little uneasy. There was something about the hidden space that bothered me, though I couldn't explain why. I left the barn and spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the feeling, but it lingered in the back of my mind. When Mark returned that evening, I told him about the floorboards. He shrugged it off, saying the barn had always been a bit strange. He said his grandfather used to store things there and probably built the hidden space for storage or tools. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the old wood settling. I stared at the ceiling, trying to push the thoughts away, but sleep wouldn't come. Around midnight, I decided to get up and go outside. The moon was bright, casting a pale light over the fields and woods. I felt drawn to the barn, as if something was pulling me toward it. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way across the yard, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. The barn felt different at night. The air inside was cool and damp, and the shadows seemed to stretch further. I walked to the back, my flashlight beam trembling slightly as I shone it on the floorboards. I don't know what made me do it, but I started pulling at the boards, using an old crowbar I'd found earlier. Took some effort, but eventually, I pried one of the boards loose. Then another. Beneath them was a dark hole, a small square opening that led into what looked like a crawl space. The smell that wafted up was earthy and stale, like damp soil and decaying leaves. I hesitated for a moment before lowering the flashlight into the hole. The beam illuminated a narrow dirt tunnel that stretched further than I could see. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't stop myself. I dropped to my knees and crawled into the opening, the flashlight clutched tightly in one hand. The tunnel was cramped, the ceiling so low that I had to keep my head down. The walls were rough, and the dirt clung to my hands and clothes. The air was heavy and still, and the only sound was my own breathing. I don't know how far I crawled, maybe 10 or 15 feet, before the tunnel widened into a small chamber. The flashlight beam revealed wooden beams supporting the walls and ceiling, as if the space had been deliberately reinforced. And then I saw it. In the center of the chamber was a small pile of objects, rusted tools, scraps of cloth, and what looked like old bones. My stomach turned as I realized they weren't animal bones. They were human. I scrambled backward, panic taking over. As I turned to leave, the flashlight caught something else. A metal box half buried in the dirt. Despite my fear, I felt compelled to open it. Inside were photographs, faded and yellowed with age. They showed people, men, women, children, all standing in front of the cabin or the barn. But there was something off about the photos. The people's faces were scratched out, leaving only blank, eerie silhouettes. I didn't take anything with me. I crawled out of the tunnel as fast as I could, replaced the boards, and ran back to the cabin. Mark was asleep, and I didn't wake him. I didn't tell him anything the next morning, either. We left the cabin a few days later, and I haven't been back since. Sometimes I think about telling Mark what I found, but I don't see the point. Whatever happened there, it's buried in the past, just like the bones under the barn. It was the summer of 2022, and my wife, Ellie, and I had decided to take a break from the chaos of the city. We rented a secluded cabin deep in the forest, about a 5-hour drive from Portland. I was 34, Ellie was 32, and we'd been married for 8 years. Life hadn't been easy lately, but this trip was meant to be a reset for us. A chance to reconnect, away from phones, work emails, and the noise of the world. The cabin was nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. The place was rustic but charming. It had a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a living room with a wood-burning stove. Outside, there was a porch with 2 rocking chairs, a fire pit, and a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. The first few days were perfect. We spent our mornings hiking the trails, our afternoons reading on the porch, and our evenings by the fire pit, watching the stars. Felt like the break we desperately needed. Ellie seemed happier, more relaxed, and for the first time in months, I felt the same. On the 4th day, a storm rolled in. It wasn't unexpected. The weather forecast had warned of heavy rain, but it came harder and faster than we anticipated. By mid-afternoon, the rain was pounding against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees. We stayed inside, playing cards and drinking wine, listening to the storm rage outside. That night, as the rain continued to pour, I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was something else. It was faint, almost like a scratching noise, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, but the sound stopped. I told myself it was probably just a branch scraping against the side of the cabin and went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check for any damage from the storm. The rain had stopped, but the ground was muddy, and the air was heavy with the scent of wet earth. As I walked around the cabin, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the mud, large, heavy prints that didn't belong to either of us. They circled the cabin, disappearing into the woods. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Could have been a hiker, I thought. Maybe someone got caught in the storm and wandered close to the cabin. But the prints didn't sit right with me. They were too deliberate, too close to the cabin, like someone had been watching us. I didn't tell Ellie about the footprints. She had been so happy these past few days, and I didn't want to ruin it. I convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. The next night, the sound returned. This time, it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't scratching. It was tapping, like someone knocking softly on the walls of the cabin. I lay in bed, heart pounding, listening as the tapping moved from one wall to another. It stopped as suddenly as it started, leaving me in silence. The following morning, I found more footprints. They were fresh, pressed into the wet earth, and they were closer to the cabin than before. My unease turned into full-blown fear. Someone was out there watching us, and I had no idea why. I told Ellie we should leave early, but she brushed it off, saying we were in the middle of nowhere and it was probably an animal. I didn't push the issue, but I kept my guard up. That evening, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I even moved a chair in front of the main door just in case. Ellie laughed at me, but I didn't care. Something about this place felt wrong now, and I wasn't taking any chances. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch. My heart raced as I lay perfectly still, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving back and forth across the wooden planks. Then came the tapping again, this time on the window of the bedroom. It was soft, almost tentative, but it was enough to send a wave of terror through me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Ellie was still asleep beside me, oblivious to what was happening. The tapping continued for what felt like hours before it stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance, and I finally allowed myself to exhale. The next morning, I decided we were leaving. I didn't care if Ellie thought I was overreacting. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what it was. But when I went outside to load the car, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. On the porch, scratched into the wood, were two words, "Leave now." My blood ran cold. Whoever had been outside last night wasn't just watching us. They wanted us gone. I didn't wait to pack everything. I grabbed the essentials, told Ellie to get in the car, and we left. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the clearing, but there was nothing, just the cabin growing smaller in the distance. We never talked about what happened. I didn't want to scare Ellie any more than she already was, and I didn't want to dwell on it myself. But even now, months later, I can't stop thinking about it. Who was out there? What did they want? And what would have happened if we hadn't left? I wasn't sure how I felt about the job when my boss called me into his office that morning. I work as a furniture maker and general handyman, mainly focused on custom pieces for cabins, cottages, and rural homes. I'm good at what I do: solid woodwork, clean lines, no shortcuts. People appreciate my craft, but this new assignment felt strange. My boss told me I'd be heading out to a remote location to build furniture and finish work for a small cabin. The owner apparently wanted the job done quickly and discreetly. No problem there. I've done plenty of remote jobs before. What stood out was how little information I was given. The cabin was deep in the woods of northern Maine, about 20 miles from the nearest town. The client paid for me to stay in the cabin while I worked, so I didn't have to worry about a daily commute. I'd bring my tools, stay for about a week, and get the job done. My boss handed me a folder with the cabin's location, a rough list of furniture to build, and the contact info for the owner. It was odd, though no name, just a phone number, and no design preferences except simple and durable. I shrugged it off. A job's a job. I packed my truck with the usual supplies: saws, chisels, sandpaper, clamps, and plenty of wood. I even brought extra food and water, knowing how isolated the place would be. I wasn't thrilled about staying in the middle of nowhere alone, but I figured it was just a week. Easy money. The drive out there was long, and the further I got from civilization, the quieter it became. The 2-lane highway turned into a gravel road, which eventually turned into little more than a dirt trail. My GPS lost signal about 15 miles out, so I relied on the printed map my boss gave me. The directions were vague. Turn left at the big rock. Follow the trail past the fallen tree. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting. The place was smaller than I expected. Just one story with a steep roof, a porch, and a single window on each side. It looked like it had been thrown together in a hurry, with raw wood siding and a stone chimney that didn't quite line up straight. The forest pressed in close on all sides, the trees tall and dense, their branches heavy with snow. The only clearing was the small patch of ground where the cabin stood. I didn't see another soul for miles. I stepped out of the truck, and the cold hit me like a punch to the face. The air was so still it felt unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I unlocked the cabin door with the key my boss had given me and stepped inside. The interior was bare. Just 4 walls, a single room with no partitions, and a small fireplace. No furniture, no insulation, just the raw frame of a building. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and the place smelled of sawdust and damp wood. There was a pile of firewood by the hearth and a stack of old blankets in one corner. Other than that, the cabin was empty. I got to work immediately, unpacking my tools and measuring the space. The job was straightforward enough. Build a bed frame, a table, a couple of chairs, and some shelves. I decided to start with the bed frame since it would take the longest. I set up my portable workbench and got to cutting and sanding the wood I brought with me. That first night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. I've spent plenty of nights alone in the woods. This was different. The cabin felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. The walls seemed too thin, the angles slightly off, like the whole thing was leaning even though the ground was level. I told myself I was imagining things, but I kept my tools close by when I went to bed, just in case. The next few days were a blur of work. I woke up with the sun, worked until it set, and spent the evenings by the fireplace sketching out designs for the next day. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, just the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I didn't see any animals, not even tracks in the snow around the cabin. It was like the forest was empty. On the 4th day, I noticed something strange. The wood I was working with felt different, heavier somehow, like it was saturated with something. It wasn't water, I checked, but it smelled faintly of iron. I couldn't figure it out, so I just kept working. By the end of the day, I had finished the table and one of the chairs. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, like branches brushing against the cabin. But as the hours passed, it grew louder, more deliberate. It sounded like footsteps, slow and heavy, circling the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window, but all I saw was darkness. The forest was so dense that my beam didn't reach far, but I didn't see anything unusual. Still, I couldn't sleep after that. I sat by the fireplace, gripping a hammer, and waited for dawn. The next day, I found tracks in the snow. They weren't animal tracks, too big, too deep. They looked like boot prints, but the tread was strange, almost smooth, like whoever made them wasn't wearing regular shoes. The prints circled the cabin and then disappeared into the woods. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the job wasn't finished, and I didn't want to explain to my boss why I bailed. I worked through the day, trying to ignore the unease building in my chest. By evening, I had finished the shelves and the second chair. I locked the cabin door and piled wood against it, just in case. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer, like whoever or whatever was out there wanted me to know it was watching. On the 6th day, I found something that stopped me cold. While cleaning up, I noticed scratches on the walls near the fireplace. They were faint but deliberate, long marks that looked like they'd been made with a knife or a claw. I hadn't seen them before, and I knew they hadn't been there when I arrived. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The footsteps circled the cabin for hours, stopping and starting, always just out of sight. The firewood pile I'd stacked against the door shifted, and I swear I heard the doorknob rattle. I stayed by the fireplace, hammer in hand, staring at the door until the sun rose. By the last day, I was done. I'd finished all the furniture, packed my tools, and loaded everything into the truck. The cabin looked complete, but it didn't feel right. As I locked the door and turned to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a carving in one of the porch posts. It was small and crude, like a symbol or a warning. I didn't recognize it, but it sent a shiver down my spine. The drive back was long and silent. I didn't look back, not once, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. When I finally reached the highway, I felt a weight lift off my chest, like I had escaped something I couldn't explain. A few weeks later, I asked my boss about the cabin. He said the owner was happy with the work and had paid in full. When I pressed for more details, he shrugged and said he didn't know much. The job had come through a friend of a friend, someone looking for a quick, quiet project. I let it go, but I couldn't stop thinking about that place. Even now, months later, I still wake up in the middle of the night, hearing footsteps outside my window. I know it's just in my head, or at least that's what I tell myself. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my workshop, I feel that same unease I felt in the cabin. Like I'm being watched, like whatever was out there didn't stay in the woods. It was the summer of 2016, and I was 28 years old. I had just gone through a messy breakup, and I needed to get away. My coworker mentioned a cabin he owned up in the Adirondacks. It wasn't fancy, just a simple one-bedroom place with a small kitchen and a bathroom. But it was secluded, surrounded by miles of forest. It sounded perfect. He handed me the key, gave me some vague directions, and told me to enjoy the peace and quiet. I didn't need much convincing. The drive took nearly 5 hours. The last stretch was a gravel road that twisted deep into the woods. The trees grew thicker the further I went, their branches tangling overhead like a canopy. The cabin appeared suddenly, as if the forest had been hiding it. It was small, with weathered wooden siding and a tin roof that had seen better days. A single porch light flickered faintly in the growing dusk. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. It wasn't just the absence of people. There were no distant hums of traffic, no airplanes overhead, just the sound of the wind pushing through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. I parked my car next to the cabin, grabbed my bags, and stepped inside. The cabin was simple but cozy. The living room had a couch and a small wood-burning stove. The kitchen was dated but functional, with a small fridge and an old gas stove. The bedroom was just big enough for a full-sized bed and a small dresser. Everything smelled faintly of pine and dust. I spent the first evening unpacking, eating a quick dinner of canned soup, and sitting on the porch with a beer. The stars were incredible out there, so many more than I was used to seeing back home. For the first time in weeks, I felt a little lighter, like the weight of the breakup was starting to lift. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. My coworker had mentioned there were some trails nearby, though they weren't marked. I packed a small bag with water and snacks, grabbed a map I'd found in one of the drawers, and headed out. The forest was beautiful. The trees were tall and ancient, their trunks covered in moss. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the ground. I followed what looked like an old deer trail, winding deeper into the woods. The air was cool and smelled of earth and pine. After about an hour, I came across a small clearing with a stream running through it. I sat on a rock, ate a granola bar, and listened to the sound of the water. It was so peaceful that I lost track of time. When I finally decided to head back, I realized I hadn't been paying attention to where I was going. The trail I'd been following had disappeared, and the forest looked the same in every direction. My heart started to race as I turned in circles, trying to get my bearings. I pulled out the map, but it was useless without any marked trails. I decided to head in what I thought was the right direction, but after half an hour of walking, I still hadn't found the cabin. The trees seemed to close in around me, their shadows growing longer as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Then I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A tree with deep, fresh scratches running down its trunk. They were too high up to be from a deer or a bear. My stomach tightened. I'd heard of mountain lions in the area, but I hadn't really thought about them until now. I kept moving, faster this time, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The forest was silent now, the kind of silence that felt wrong. Even the birds had stopped chirping. Just as I was starting to panic, I spotted the cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me as I stumbled onto the porch and slammed the door behind me. My heart was pounding, and I realized my hands were shaking. I told myself I was being paranoid. The scratches could have been from anything, and getting lost was my own fault for not paying attention. I made myself a quick dinner, locked all the doors, and tried to relax. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me sit up and listen. The creak of the cabin settling, the rustle of leaves outside. It all felt amplified in the dark. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft thud, like something heavy had landed on the porch. I sat frozen in bed, straining to hear more. Another thud, this time closer to the door. Then the sound of something scratching against the wood. I grabbed the flashlight I'd brought with me and crept to the window. My hands were trembling as I pulled back the curtain. The porch was empty, but the light above the door was swinging slightly, as if something had brushed against it. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a fox, but the thought didn't bring much comfort. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, listening to the sounds outside. The next morning, I found the source of the noise. Deep scratches ran across the porch, the wood splintered as if something had clawed at it. They looked just like the marks I'd seen on the tree. I spent the day inside, too uneasy to go back into the woods. I tried reading, but I couldn't focus. Every now and then, I'd glance at the window, half expecting to see something staring back at me. That evening, as the sun began to set, I heard the sound of branches snapping in the distance. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. I grabbed a kitchen knife and stood by the door, my heart racing. The noise stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was even worse. I stayed there for what felt like hours listening, but there was nothing. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside, the forest was still. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my bags, cleaned up the cabin, and locked the door behind me. As I started my car and pulled onto the gravel road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I never told my coworker about what happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I've thought about it a lot since then, and I still can't explain it. Those scratches, the noises, the silence in the woods, it all felt too deliberate, too targeted. I haven't been back to the woods since. Even now, years later, I can't sit outside at night without feeling that same prickling on the back of my neck, like something is out there, watching. I was 32 when it happened. It was late October, 2017. The air was crisp, the leaves had turned, and the days were getting shorter. I decided to spend a weekend at a remote hunting cabin I had rented in northern Minnesota, near the Canadian border. The cabin was about 3 hours from my small town, tucked deep into the forest, far from any main roads or cell towers. I wasn't a professional hunter by any means, just a guy who enjoyed the quiet of the woods and the challenge of tracking game. This cabin was perfect for that. Simple, no electricity, no running water, and a wood stove to keep you warm. The closest neighbor was at least 10 miles away, and the property was surrounded by dense forest and rocky hills. It was isolated, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed everything I thought I'd need: a rifle, ammo, hunting gear, warm clothes, canned food, a few jugs of water, and a reliable old flashlight with extra batteries. I also brought a heavy-duty sleeping bag since the nights were supposed to drop below freezing. I got there Friday afternoon. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough and narrow, barely wide enough for my truck. The cabin itself was modest: a single room with a cot, a small table, and a wood stove in the corner. A stack of firewood was piled against the outside wall, and the only light came from the sun filtering through the trees or the kerosene lantern hanging inside. After unloading my truck, I decided to scout the area. The forest was thick, the ground carpeted with pine needles that muffled my steps. I found some deer tracks not far from the cabin and marked the spot mentally for the next morning. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a can of chili on the wood stove, listened to the sounds of the forest, and eventually crawled into my sleeping bag. The quiet out there was almost overwhelming. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant howl of a coyote. I woke up early Saturday and set out to hunt. The day was cold but clear, and I spent hours trekking through the woods. I saw some movement here and there, mostly squirrels and the occasional rabbit, but no deer. By mid-afternoon, I was getting tired and decided to head back to the cabin. As I approached the clearing where the cabin sat, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The door was still closed, and nothing seemed disturbed, but the air felt heavier, like the woods were holding their breath. I shook it off, telling myself I was just tired and hungry. That evening, I built a fire in the stove and made some soup. The warmth and the steady crackle of the fire were comforting, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just the isolation getting to me. I went to bed early, but my sleep was restless. At some point in the night, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, my heart pounding. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the sound didn't stop. It circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. Whatever it wasn't walking on 4 legs. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, my hands shaking. I didn't turn on the light right away, not wanting to give away my position. I just sat there, clutching the rifle, listening as the footsteps stopped near the front door. Then there was a soft knock. My blood ran cold. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere? It was after midnight, and the nearest house was miles away. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The knock came again, louder this time. I stayed frozen, my mind racing. Should I call out? Turn on the light? Open the door? Every option felt wrong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had convinced myself it had to be a prank. A couple of kids who had somehow found the cabin and thought it would be funny to mess with me. But when I stepped outside, there were no tracks in the dirt, no sign anyone had been there. I spent the day hunting again, trying to shake the memory of the night before. I didn't see a single deer, and the woods felt off, like they were watching me. That night, I locked the door and braced a chair under the handle for good measure. I kept the rifle within arm's reach and left the flashlight on the table. I was determined to get through the night without freaking out. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something tapping on the window. The cabin only had one small window, and it was covered with an old curtain. The tapping was slow and steady, like someone was running their fingernail along the glass. I sat up, my heart pounding. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then came the sound of something brushing against the wall, moving toward the door. I grabbed the rifle and flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold them. The brushing sound stopped at the door, and then there was a loud, deliberate knock. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the door, yelling for whoever it was to leave. The knocking stopped. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat there, rifle in hand, waiting for the sun to come up. When morning finally came, I packed up my things and got the hell out of there. As I loaded my truck, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A single set of footprints leading from the woods to the cabin. They were barefoot and far too large to be a child's. I followed them a few feet into the trees before they disappeared, as if whoever or whatever it was had simply vanished. I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Maybe it was a person, some lunatic living out in the woods. Or maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I'll never forget those nights, and I'll never feel completely safe in the woods again.